Hello there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh, and Ross Widget and I today are to be found in Bampton. Now we're here because just a few days ago, the first Downton Abbey movie was released. And we're here to show you exactly how Bampton was involved in that movie. We're going to show you around the church, where Matthew Crawley and Mary were married, and Edith was dumped at the altar. We're going to show you the house where Isabel Crawley lived for all those years, a house which was also used as the green room for the actors during the filming of the series. Behind me is the post office of Downton, and on my left, the old grammar school, which of course was the cottage hospital in Downton Abbey. And this is the field where we see Lord Grantham talking about the future development of the village. It's also the field in which the cast threw a wrap party for the villagers of Bampton at the end of the TV series. So how did it all begin? In 2008, Donald Woods, a leading film designer, had just finished a series for the BBC called Cranford. To find the location for this series, he and his staff had scoured the countryside of southwest England, looking for the perfect village, eventually ending up in Laycock. Now, a new costume series was planned for ITV, written by Julian Fellows, called Downton Abbey. It was to be set in Yorkshire, and the main house had already been chosen as Highclere Castle. Donald knew that he'd visited almost all the potential locations in the region and was bemoaning the fact that it would be extremely difficult to find another village that would meet his criteria. He needed somewhere that was built of stone, matching as closely as possible that of Yorkshire, and which would also look as though it could convincingly be the village built up around the castle. Perhaps his most challenging requirement was a village that would not need him to close down any businesses whilst filming. All film companies are extremely sensitive to the fact that disruption during filming must be kept to a minimum. He needed a place that had two distinct centres, one of which was unencumbered by shops and had a church sufficiently grand for his purposes. Like many people over the centuries, he'd never found Bampton. It's not an accident that it used to be called Bampton in the Bush, but the person to whom he was speaking was the country's most distinguished television film producer, Dame Pippa Harris, who happened to live here. She suggested he might like to have a look at Bampton. Within a week he was here with his team, and it looked as though he'd found the perfect place. The church close was quiet, pretty much untouched for centuries, easy to close off from traffic, separate from the commercial centre of the village, and all within an hour and a half of Highclere and London. On a more practical note, it also had an enormous parking space at the recreation ground where the fleet of lorries, canteens and buses that always come with a film crew could base themselves, and an enthusiastic parish council who would work with him to facilitate their needs. Television costume drama at the time was on the wane. No one expected Downton to be more than one series long, but they were delighted to have found their location and set about the planning and then in 2009 the filming of Series 1 with enjoyment. Little did they, or indeed Pippa Harris, know that this was to become the biggest television phenomenon of all time. So behind me is the Church of St Mary's in Bampton. This wonderful church, sitting in the middle of its medieval minster enclosure, is one of the joys of our village. In the 1st century AD, there was an Anglo-Saxon religious community here, and it's probable that there was a church on the site well before the Norman invasion. But the magnificent church we see today was largely built in the 12th and 13th centuries. It was the scene of all the funerals and weddings, both successful and otherwise, in Downton, and was the only building in Bampton filmed on the inside. The graveyard has been the source of the greatest confusion for the fans of Downton, where many visitors have been found searching for the gravestone of Matthew Crawley. The set builders tell us that it also created the biggest continuity problem. Having killed off many characters in the war and the flu epidemic, there were 11 gravestones and memorials they had to get in exactly the same place for each series. When setting up Sybil's tomb for a shoot towards the end of the series, they heard an American visitor say to her husband, "I told you she was buried here," only for her to be dumbfounded when two burly set builders picked it up and moved it 2 feet to the left. Churchgate House was the home of the Crawley family throughout the series, and whilst all the filming of the house was from the outside, the house itself was used as a green room for the stars. There's many a tale of jollity and fun, including some very exciting antics in the swimming pool, about which the village is sworn to secrecy. The owner of the house was surprised last summer to find a stranger walking around in her garden, and when she approached the visitor, she was amazed to be asked if she'd bought the house from the Crawley family. There is a serious blurring of reality and fiction around this series that has touched so deeply the lives of so many. The old grammar school found fame as the Downton Cottage Hospital. This lovely 17th century building was gifted to the village as a free school by one Robert Vasey. A local landowner whose reputation has taken a bit of a beating recently. Research into his life by the Oxford academic Professor Peter McCulloch suggests he wasn't quite the good-natured wool merchant we'd always thought him to be, but we don't hold it against him. We've raised a great deal of money over the last few years for the restoration of this building, in a campaign supported by Hugh Bonneville, who made a short film for us to introduce the project.
This is the Downton Cottage Hospital, where Lady Sybil helped Dr. Clarkson treat recuperating soldiers during the First World War, and where Mrs. Hughes came when she feared she might be seriously ill.
Thanks to the tireless work of our huge team of volunteers, we've successfully restored the roof of the building, and we're doing well towards raising the huge sums needed for the replacement of the staircase and the reopening of the top floor. Once finished, there'll be a permanent exhibition of the filming of Downton in Bampton, along with other exhibitions and events. With the help and generosity of the many visitors from all over the world who've come here to visit Bampton, and those who will come in the future, we're confident of success. The other small buildings vital to the plot are the 2 pubs and the post office, transformed into their new roles by the addition of a few props, signs and seats for the pubs, and posters and a pillar box for the post office. Just recently, Hugh Bonneville revisited Bampton with BBC Radio to record a documentary on the locations of Downton, and we had an interesting conversation.
Just to set the scene where we are, we're outside the church, which obviously I visited quite frequently when we were filming here.
It was rather wonderful when you were here because the place was empty of cars. It's life goes on in the village like this, and it's a busy place. But of course nowadays we have a lot of visitors as well as a result of your being here.
So we're now heading out of the church through the church gate, and we've got Churchgate House on the right. Up ahead of us is the old school. This building, of course, featured as the cottage hospital in the show.
It was built in 17th century by a man called Robert Vasey, who we always used to think was a rather wonderful wool merchant and generous man, but recent research has made us discover that he was actually something of a rogue.
Oh.
He was a moneylender. But we don't mind. He gave us his money and he built this lovely building.
We're standing outside it now, and it says, Bampton Library on one side and Bampton Archive and Vesey Room. So it has a dual function at the moment.
It does, and will continue to do so. It is where our library is based. The village library is thriving and extremely valuable to the village. That will always remain here. But also it'll have, for a while anyway, a permanent exhibition of the filming of Downton Abbey in Bampton, which draws people from all over the world. And so we will give them a much increased tourism offering once it's finished.
Leads us nicely on to talking about the impact of filming, not just Downton, but other projects that may or may not have been filmed here over the years. Yeah. Obviously, it can bring in tourism, which can be a good thing. The bus gets stuck, people can't park, can't get to their houses. There must be a downside to the upside.
On the whole, the people of Bampton have really enjoyed the Downton experience. It continues, and the tourist numbers grow. Even now, they're growing, even though the series finished quite a long time ago. The projections are that we will go on having, tens of thousands of visitors every year.
Tens of thousands?
Yes, we had certainly 27,000, I think it was, that came through this shop last year.
Good Lord.
So it's become, Downton is one of the most extraordinary phenomena in this business ever, and it's worldwide. There's a map here, which obviously, these are buttons for people who visited the shop.
We're looking at
world.
there's a map of the world with little pins, and people, presumably when they visit, they can stick in which country they're from.
Wherever they're from.
So we're looking at, there's quite a lot in Southeast Australia, a lot from New Zealand, a lot from Perth, a lot from, interestingly, quite a lot from China, India, South Africa.
And those were mostly during the course of the latter half of last year. And of course, there's a huge American contingent, but also South American.
Yeah.
And this year, it's only just started, but as you can see,
Is this a new map?
this is brand new map for this.
Oh,
this
so
year.
that
This
was
is last year.
God, that was all 1 year.
All in 1 year.
Gosh, so a huge amount from America, a lot from Europe, a lot from the Far East, and a huge amount from, as I say, Southeast Australia. So this year already, you've got, the United States is populating quite nicely. You've got some from Brazil there, from Australia, Taiwan, Japan. Oh, well.
It does, of course, have its drawbacks. The coaches are one thing, and that is down to us to find a solution to that problem. They'll come in. We have to accept the fact that it's happening, and that is something that this village is constantly talking about. But also facilities. Not to put too fine a point on it, when people arrive in that sort of numbers, you need loos and you need all kinds of things. These are not things that this village was prepared for. It was known as Bampton in the bush, and for a good reason, because it's almost impossible to get to. And hardly everybody came here, nobody came here. But now it has become clear that we're going to have to do something about that. So you could say that's a downside. But I'm not sure that that's necessarily right. I think, in fact, what is happening to Bampton is, in the long run, going to turn out to be extremely beneficial.
Well, I suppose so, yes, in the longer term. Because when we filmed here, we parked up at the sports field, didn't we, just outside town, and then got bussed in either cars or small minibuses. So I think the problems of having 49 seaters clogging up the lanes, wasn't something we'd quite anticipated either.
I have to say that we all have a sort of proprietorial feeling about Downton Abbey, and indeed about the cast. If you wandered around this village, you'd get an awful lot of high hues, but not a lot of sort of pestering.
Yeah. Well, do you remember on our final visit of the main TV show, we had a fantastic barbecue and so on, and straw bales everywhere, and a good cider bar, etc., out on the field at the back there. So that was a nice farewell.
It was an absolutely wonderful evening, and being served burgers and wine by you guys was enormous fun. And there are a lot of sort of photographic evidence of that. It's the archive is full of that.
The early part of the evening, anyway.
Mostly the early part of the evening. Yes, it was a very jolly event. No, well, as I say, we have a very fond feeling about it all. But the managing of it is a grown-up business, and there's no question we're going to have to do a certain amount of that as time goes by.
Robin, thank you. I'm going to move on to the post office, as it was in the show, which is actually called Corner Cottage, is that right?
That's right, and it's literally 30 yards from where we are sitting.
If you would like to hear the full programme, you can find it on the BBC Sounds app. During the TV series, the crew came to Bampton about twice a year. The day before filming was to begin, the set builders arrived, a crew of brilliant carpenters, electricians and artists, whose job it was to take the village back in time. As we have seen, the village made little in the way of difficulty when it came to removing signs of the 20th century. Despite many efforts by that band of people whose time is spent looking for fault, there were very few incidents of wayward television aerials, modern building materials and so on. One did claim to have seen the yellow lines on the road, but since there's never been yellow lines in the square, that seems unlikely. The pillar box, next to the post office, was an opportunistic success. The grim reality of a dog poo bin was transformed into a stone pillar so realistic that people were seen posting letters through the slot, only for them to drop amongst the mess below. Wires, electric trunking, modern guttering, any sign at all of the modern world was covered up, and the church close retreated 150 years in a single day. As the series progressed, more and more things had to be reproduced. The war memorial, plaques on the walls, the pub signs, all had to be exactly the same as before.
and as we've already seen, the graveyard was particularly challenging. By the time Series 6 came to an end, the crew and cast of Downton had become familiar figures in Bampton. Many of the crew had made friends in the village over the years, and the stars could be sure of a warm but unobtrusive welcome from the villagers. It's true that such was the phenomenal success of Downton. The village filled up with paparazzi whenever the crew were here, and security had to be a little tighter than it was at the beginning. But it was always an open set, and the villagers and their friends, as well as the visitors who timed it well, were able to watch every step of the filming. When the end came, it was slightly sad. We got used to the sight of these stars walking the streets, and some of us felt as if we were part of this extraordinary phenomenon. The generosity with which the cast and crew threw a party for the village on their last night suggests that they felt at least slightly the same way. It was a great deal of fun being served a glass of wine and a hamburger by Lord Grantham himself, with Mrs. Patmore bustling around in the background. In September 2019, the film of Downton was released. The crew had returned for a 2-day visit, but somehow it wasn't quite the same. The scale of the thing was huge by comparison. Many of the familiar people in the crew were not there, and the stars were hustled on set in limousines, keen to avoid the by now huge numbers of photographers. The weather was extremely unkind. The wind blew a gale, and the filming was done mainly inside the church and in the gardens of Churchgate House, out of sight of the crowds. We now know that at least one of the scenes filmed on that day had to be reshot later at Highclere Castle. We know, however, that Bampton's place in the firmament of film locations is firmly established, and we can expect the pleasure of visitors from every corner of the globe for many years to come. So we'll leave you in this beautiful Sandford field, the site of our wonderful barbecue with the cast of Downton Abbey. We hope that they might come back one day, and you never know, they may be filming in this field once again. We hope you've enjoyed our little tour around Bampton, and we'll see you in the depths of the Cotswolds in the very near future.